As I said, watch out for part 2. And this is part 2 of the Brothers Karamazov series by written by Fyodor Dostoevsky. But before we move on, a moment of silence for Father Zuzima, the celebrated elder at the monastery in town. He died in this part 2. Okay, so in the first video series, I gave depth into the characters I felt were noteworthy of mention. In that sense, I have to give depth towards the character of the elder, Father Zuzima, in terms of the event in his youthful life that led to him becoming a monk, an elder at the monastery. The wound is where the light enters you. Rumi. Father Zuzima was born in a distant province in the north, in the town of V. His father was a gentleman by birth, but of no great consequence or position. Father Zuzima's father died when he was only 2 years old, and Father Zuzima didn't remember his father at all. Father Zuzima's father left his mother a small house built of wood and a fortune not large but sufficient to keep her and her children in comfort. There were two of them, Father Zuzima's elder brother, Michael, and him. Michael, Father Zuzima's elder brother, was 8 years older than Father Zuzima. He was of hasty, irritable temperament, but kind-hearted and never ironical. Michael was remarkably silent, especially at home with Father Zuzima, their mother, and the servants. He did well at school, but did not get on with his school fellows, though he never quarreled. 6 months before the death of Michael, Father Zuzima's elder brother, when Michael was 17, he made friends with a political exile who had been banished from Moscow to their town for free thinking. And this individual led a solitary existence. This friend of Michael was a good scholar who had gained distinction in philosophy in the university. Something made this individual to take a fancy to Michael, and he used to ask Michael to see him. The young man, this individual, would spend whole evenings with Michael during that winter. Till the exile, this individual was summoned to Petersburg to take up his post again at his own request, as he had powerful friends. It was the beginning of Lent, which is a period of fasting and regret for one's sins that is observed on the 40 weekdays from Ash Wednesday to Easter by many churches. And Michael would not fast. He was rude and laughed at it. That's all silly twaddle, and there is no God, he said, horrifying their mother, the servants, and Father Zuzima too. For though Father Zuzima was only 9 at that time, he too was aghast at hearing such words. In the 6th week in Lent, Michael, who was never strong and had a tendency to consumption, was taken ill. He was tall but thin and delicate looking, and of very pleasing countenance. The doctor came and soon whispered to their mother that it was galloping consumption, that Michael would not live through the spring. Their mother began weeping, and, careful not to alarm Michael, she entreated him to go to church to confess and take the sacrament, as Michael was still able to move about. This made Michael angry, and he said something profane about the church. He grew thoughtful, however. He guessed at once that he was seriously ill, and that was why his mother was begging him to confess and take the sacrament. 3 days passed, and Holy Week had come, And on Tuesday morning, Michael began going to church. "I am doing this simply for your sake, mother, to please and comfort you," he said. The mother wept with joy and grief. His end must be near, she thought, if there is such a change in him. But Michael was not able to go to church long. He took to his bed, so he had to confess and take the sacrament at home. A marvelous change passed over Michael. His spirit seemed transformed. Everyone wondered at his words. He spoke so strangely and positively. They were all touched and wept. Many times afterwards, Father Zozima remembered, even with tears, how Michael told him to enjoy life for him too. Michael died the third week after Easter. Father Zozima was left alone with his mother. Her friends began advising her to send Father Zozima to Petersburg, as other parents did. "You have only one son now," they said, "and have a fair income, and you will be depriving him, perhaps, of a brilliant career if you keep him here." They suggested that Father Zozima should be sent to Petersburg to the Cadet Corps, that Father Zozima might afterwards enter the Imperial Guard. Father Zozima's mother hesitated for a long time. It was awful to part with her only child, but she made up her mind to it at last, though not without many tears, believing she was acting for Father Zozima's happiness. She brought Father Zozima to Petersburg and put him into the Cadet Corps, and he never saw her again, for she too died 3 years afterwards. She spent those 3 years mourning and grieving for Father Zozima and Markel. Father Zozima spent a long time, almost 8 years, in the military cadet school at Petersburg. He had come into his own money, and so flung himself into a life of pleasure and plunged headlong into all the recklessness of youth. He was fond of reading, yet strange to say, the Bible was the one book he never opened at that time, though he always carried it about and was never separated from it. After 4 years of this life, Father Zozima chanced to be in the town of K, where his regiment was stationed at the time. The people of the town were hospitable, rich, and fond of entertainment. Father Zozima was met with a cordial reception everywhere, as he was of a lively temperament and was known to be well off, which always goes a long way in the world. And then a circumstance happened, which was the beginning of it all. Father Zozima formed an attachment to a beautiful and intelligent young girl of noble and lofty character, the daughter of people much respected. They were well-to-do people of influence and position. Father Zozima fancied that the young lady looked on him with favor, and his heart was aflame at such an idea. Later on, Father Zozima saw and fully realized that he perhaps was not so passionately in love with this lady at all, but only recognized the elevation of her mind and character, which he could not indeed have helped doing. Father Zozima was prevented, however, from making her an offer, at the time by his selfishness. He was loath to part with the allurements of his free and licentious bachelor life in the heyday of his youth, and with his pockets full of money. He did drop some hints as to his feelings, however, though he put off taking any decisive step for a time. Then all of a sudden, his regiment was ordered off for 2 months to another district. On Father Zozima's return, 2 months later, he found a young lady already married to a rich neighboring landowner. A very amiable man, still young, though older than Father Zozima was, connected with the best Petersburg society, which Father Zozima wasn't, and of excellent education, which Father Zozima wasn't. Father Zozima was so overwhelmed at this unexpected circumstance that his mind was positively clouded. The worst of it all was that the young landowner had been a long while betrothed to the lady, and Father Zozima had met him indeed many times in her house, but blinded by his conceit, he had noticed nothing. And this particularly mortified Father Zozima. Almost everyone had known all about it, while he knew nothing. He was filled with sudden, irrepressible fury. Ah! Father Zozima waited for an opportunity and succeeded in insulting his rival in the presence of a large company. He then forced his rival to ask for an explanation and behaved so rudely that his rival accepted his challenge, a duel, in spite of the vast inequality between them, as Father Zuzima was a younger person of no consequence and of inferior rank. In those days, though, duels were severely punished, yet dueling was a kind of fashion among the officers, so strong and deeply rooted will a brutal prejudice sometimes be. It was the end of June, and their meeting was to take place at 7 o'clock the next day on the outskirts of the town. And then something happened that was in very truth a turning point of Father Zuzima's life. In the evening, returning home in a savage and brutal humor, Father Zuzima flew into a rage with his orderly, Afanasi, and gave this orderly 2 blows in the face with all his might so that it was covered with blood. This orderly had not long been in the service of Father Zuzima, and Father Zuzima had struck him before, but never with such ferocious cruelty. Father Zuzima then went on to bed and slept for about 3 hours. When he woke up, the day was breaking. He got up. He did not want to sleep anymore. He went to the window, opened it. He looked out upon the garden. He saw the sun rising. It was warm and beautiful. The birds were singing. What's the meaning of it? Father Uzima thought. I feel in my heart as it were something vile and shameful. Is it because I'm going to shed blood? No, Father Zuzima thought. I feel it's not that. Can it be that I am afraid of death? Afraid of being killed? No, that's not it. That's not it at all. And all at once, Father Zuzima knew what it was. It was because he had beaten Afanasi the evening before. It all rose before his mind. It all was, as it were, repeated over again. Afanasi stood before Father Zuzima as he was beating him straight on the face, and Afanasi was holding his arms stiffly down, his head erect, his eyes fixed upon Father Zuzima as though on parade. Afanasi staggered at every blow and did not even dare to raise his hands to protect himself. That is what a man has been brought to, and that was a man beating a fellow creature. What a crime. It was as though a sharp dagger had pierced Father Zuzima right through. He stood as if he were struck dumb while the sun was shining, the leaves were rejoicing, and the birds were trilling the praise of God. Father Zuzima hid his face in his hands, fell on his bed, and broke into a storm of tears. And then he remembered his brother, Michael, and what he said on his deathbed to his servants. My dear ones, why do you wait on me? Why do you love me? Am I what you're waiting on me? Yes, am I worth it? Flashed through the mind of Father Zuzima. After all, what am I worth that another man, a fellow creature, made in the likeness and image of God, should serve me? For the first time in Father Zuzima's life, this question forced itself upon him. Michael, Father Zuzima's elder brother, had said, Mother, my little heart, in truth we are responsible to all for all. It's only that men don't know this. If they knew it, the world would be a paradise at once. God, can that too be false? Father Zuzima thought as he wept. In truth, perhaps, I am more than all others responsible for all, a greater sinner than all men in the world. And all at once, the whole truth in its full light appeared to Father Zuzima. What was he going to do? He was going to kill a good, clever, nobleman who had done him no wrong, and by depriving his wife of happiness for the rest of her life, he would be torturing and killing her too. Father Zuzima laid thus on his bed with his face in the pillow, heedless how the time was passing. Suddenly, his second, the ensign, came in with the pistols to fetch Father Zuzima. Ah, the ensign said, it's a good thing you are up already. It's time we're off. Come along. Father Zuzima did not know what to do and hurried to and fro, undecided. They went out to the carriage. However, wait here a minute, Father Zuzima said to the ensign. I will be back directly. I have forgotten my purse. Father Zuzima ran back alone to Afanasi's little room. Afanasi, he said, I gave you 2 blows on the face yesterday. Forgive me, Father Zuzima said. Afanasi started as though he were frightened and looked at Father Zuzima. And Father Zuzima saw that it was not enough, and on the spot, in his full officer's uniform, he dropped at the feet of Afanasi and bowed his head to the ground. Forgive me, Father Zozima said. Then Afanasi was completely aghast. Your Honor, sir, what are you doing? Am I worth it? And Afanasi burst out crying, as Father Zozima had done before. He hid his face in his hands, turned to the window, and shook all over with his sobs. Father Zozima flew out to his comrade and jumped into the carriage. So they reached the place and found Father Zozima's rival there with his ensign waiting for them. They were placed 12 paces apart. His rival had the first shot. Father Zozima stood gaily, looking at his rival full in the face. Father Zozima did not twitch an eyelash. He looked lovingly at his rival, for Father Zozima knew what he would do. His rival's shot just grazed Father Zozima's cheek and ear. Thank God, Father Zozima cried. No man has been killed. And Father Zozima seized his pistol, turned back and flung it far away into the wood. That's the place for you, Father Zozima cried. Father Zozima turned to his adversary. Forgive me, young fool that I am, sir, he said, for my unprovoked insults to you, and for forcing you to fire at me. I am 10 times worse than you, and more, maybe. Tell that to the person whom you hold dearest in the world. Father Zozima felt he ought to have owned up to his fault as soon as he got to the place where the duel was to take place, before his rival had fired a shot, before leading his rival into a great and deadly sin. But to act in that way would have been almost impossible, for only after Father Zozima had faced the shot at the distance of 12 paces could his words have any significance to his rival. Oh, I am ready to approve of you now, said Father Zozima's rival. Will you shake hands? For I believe you are genuinely sincere. No, Father Zozima said. Not now. Later on, when I have grown worthier and deserve your esteem, then shake hands, and you will do well. Then they went home, all Father Zozima's comrades, heard of the affair at once, and gathered together to pass judgment on him the same day. He has disgraced the uniform, they said. Let him resign his commission. My dear friends and comrades, said Father Zuzima, don't worry about my resigning my commission, for I have done so already. I have sent in my papers this morning, and as soon as I get my discharge, I shall go into a monastery. It's with that object I am leaving the regiment. As you all know by now, I make use of analogies to buttress my views or perceptions, and in this particular instance, I would employ the use of the story of the famous writer Anton Chekhov, which I came across in the book The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. As a child, Anton Chekhov, he lived between 1860 to 1904. The future celebrated writer faced each morning with a feeling of dread. Would he be beaten that day by his father or somehow spared? Without warning and sometimes without any apparent cause, his father, Pavel Yegorovich, would strike him hard several times with a cane or a whip or the back of his hand. What made it doubly confusing was that his father did not beat him out of any apparent malice or anger. He told Anton he was doing it out of love. It was God's will that children be beaten to instill humility. That was how he had been raised. And look at what a fine man he had turned into. At the end of the beating, young Anton had to kiss his father's hand and ask to be forgiven. At least, he was not alone in the ordeal. His 4 brothers and 1 sister all received the same treatment. The beating was not the only thing he came to dread. In the afternoon, he would hear his father's approaching footsteps outside their ramshackle wooden house, and he would tremble with fear. More often than not, he was coming to the house at that hour to ask the child, Anton, to replace him in the grocery shop that he owned in the backwater town of Taganrog, Russia, where the family lived. For most of the year, the shop was unbearably cold. While minding the counter, Anton would try to do his homework, but his fingers would quickly become numb and the ink in the pot for his pen would freeze up. In that mess of a store which smelled of rancid meat, he would have to listen to the dirty jokes of the Ukrainian peasants who worked there and witness the lewd behavior of the assortment of town drunks who wandered in for their shots of vodka. In the midst of all this, he had to make sure that every kopeck was accounted for, or he would get an added thrashing from his father. He would often be left there for hours while his father was getting drunk somewhere else. There was no respite from the father's presence. On Sunday, the one day the shop was closed, he would wake the children up at 4 or 5 in the morning to rehearse their singing for the church choir, of which he was the director. Once from the service, they would have to repeat it, ritual by ritual, on their own, then return for the noon mass. By the time it was over, they were all too exhausted to play. Then, in 1875, everything changed for the Chekhov family. Anton's two older brothers, Alexander and Nikolai, had had enough of their father. They decided to move together to Moscow. Alexander to pursue a university degree and Nikolai to become an artist. This snubbing of his authority infuriated the father, but he could not stop them. At around the same time, Pavel Yegorovich had to finally confront his complete mismanagement of the grocery store. He had piled up debts over the years, and now the bills came due. Facing bankruptcy and almost certainly time in the debtor's prison, he quietly slipped out of town one night without telling his wife and escaped to Moscow, intending to live with his sons. The mother was forced to sell the family possessions to pay the debt. A brother who lived with them offered to help the mother with their case against the creditors, but much to her surprise, he used his court connections to swindle the Chekhovs out of their house without a penny to her name. The mother was forced to leave for Moscow with the other children. Only Anton would stay to finish his studies and get his diploma. He was charged with selling all the remaining family belongings and sending the money to Moscow as soon as possible. The former boarder, now owner of the house, gave Anton a corner of one room to live in. And so at the age of 16, with no mercy of his own and no family to look after, Anton was suddenly left to fend for himself in Taganrog. Anton had never really been alone before. His family had been his whole life, for better or worse. Now it was as if the bottom had dropped out. He had no one to turn to for help in any way. He blamed his father for this miserable fate, for being trapped in Tagarog. One day, he felt angry and bitter. The next day, depressed. But soon, it became clear that he had no time for such sentiments. He had no money or resources, and yet somehow he had to survive. So he hired himself out as a tutor to as many families as possible. When they went on vacation, he would often go hungry for days. His worn jacket was threadbare. He had no galoshes for the heavy rains. He felt ashamed when he entered people's houses, shivering, and his feet all wet, but at least he was not able to support himself. He had decided to become a doctor. He had a scientific frame of mind, and doctors made a good living. To get into medical school, he would have to study much harder, frequenting a town library, the only place he could work in peace and quiet. He began to also browse the literature and philosophy sections, and soon he felt his mind soaring far beyond Taganrog. With books, he no longer felt so trapped. At night, he returned to his corner of the room to write stories and sleep. He had no privacy, but he could keep his corner neat and tidy, free of the usual disorder of the Chekhov household. He had finally begun to settle down, and new thoughts and emotions came to him. Work was no longer something he dreaded. He loved absorbing his mind in his studies, and tutoring had made him feel proud and dignified. He could take care of himself. Letters came from his family. Alexandra ranting and complaining about their father, making everyone miserable again. Mikhail, the youngest son, feeling worthless and depressed. Anton wrote back to Alexandra, "Stop obsessing over our father and start taking care of yourself." He wrote to Mikhail, why do you refer to yourself as my worthless, insignificant little brother? Do you know where you should be? Do you know where you should be aware of your worthlessness? Before God, perhaps, but not before people. Among people, you should be aware of your worth. Even Anton was surprised by the new tone he was taking in these letters. Then one day, several months after being abandoned, he wandered through the streets of Taganrog and suddenly felt welling up from within a tremendous and overwhelming sense of empathy and love for his parents. Where did this come from? He had never felt this before. In the days leading up to this moment, he had been thinking long and hard about his father. Was he really to blame for all their problems? Pavel's father, Yegor Mikhailovich, had been born a serfdom being a form of indentured slavery. The Chekhovs had been serfs for several generations. Yegor had finally been able to buy the family's freedom, and he set his three sons up in different fields. Pavel, designated as the family merchant, but Pavel could not cope. He had an artistic temperament. Could have been a painter or musician if he felt bitter at his fate. A grocery store and six children. His father had beaten him, and so he beat his children. Although no longer a serf, Pavel still bowed and kissed the hand of every local official and landowner. He remained a serf at heart. Anton could see that he and his siblings were falling into the same pattern, bitter, secretly feeling worthless, and wanting to take their anger out on others. Now that he was alone and taking care of himself, Anton yearned to be free in the truest sense of the word. He wanted to be free of the past, free of his father. And here, as he walked the streets of Taganrog, the answer came to him from these new and sudden emotions. Understanding his father, he could accept and even love him. He was not some imposing tyrant, but a rather helpless old man with a bit of distance. He could feel compassion and forgive the beatings. He would not become enmeshed in all of the negative feelings his father inspired, and he could finally value as well his kind mother and not blame her for being so weak. With his mind emptied of rancor and obsessive thoughts of his lost childhood, it was as if a great weight had been suddenly lifted off him. He felt light. He made a vow to himself: no more bowing and apologizing to people, no more complaining and blaming, no more disorderly living and wasting time. The answer to everything was work and love. Work and love. He had to spread his message to his family and save them. He had to share it with mankind through his stories and plays. The moment his mother left him to be alone in Taganrog, young Anton Chekhov felt trapped, as if he had been thrown into prison. He would be forced to work as much as he could outside his studies. He was now stuck in this hopelessly dull backwater with no support system, living in the corner of a small room. Bitter thoughts about his fate and about the childhood he had never had gnawed at him in his few free moments. But as the weeks went by, he noticed something very strange. He actually liked the work he did as a tutor, even though the pay was meager rather, and he was continually running around town. His father had kept telling him he was lazy, and he had believed it, but now he was not so sure. Each day represented a challenge to find more work and put food on the table. He was succeeding in this. He was succeeding in this. He was not some miserable worm who needed a beating. Besides, the work was a way to get outside himself and immerse his mind in the problems of his students. The books he read took him far away from Taganrog and filled him with interesting thoughts that lingered in his mind for entire days. Taganrog itself was not so bad. Each shop, each house contained the oddest characters, supplying him endless materials for stories. And that corner of the room, that was his kingdom. Far from feeling trapped, he now felt liberated. What had actually changed? Certainly not his circumstances, or Taganrog, or the corner of the room. What had changed was his attitude, which opened him up to new experiences and possibilities. Once he felt this, he wanted to take it further. The greatest remaining impediment to this sense of freedom was his father. No matter what he tried, he couldn't seem to get rid of deep feelings of bitterness. It was as if he could still feel the beatings and hear the endless pointed criticisms. As a last result, he tried to analyze his father as if he were a character in a story. This led him to think about his father's father. and all the generations of Chekhovs. As he considered his father's erratic nature and his wild imagination, he could understand how he must have felt trapped by his circumstances and why he turned to drinking and tyrannizing the family. He was helpless, more a victim than an oppressor. This understanding of his father laid the groundwork for the sudden rush of unconditional love he felt one day for his parents. As he glowed with this new emotion, he finally felt completely liberated from resentment and anger. The negative emotion from the past had finally fallen away from him. His mind could now be completely open. The story of Anton Chekhov is really a paradigm for what we all face in life. We carry with us traumas and hurts from early childhood in our social life. As we get older, we accumulate disappointments and slights. We too are often haunted by a sense of worthlessness, of not really deserving the good things in life. We all have moments of great doubt about ourselves. These emotions can lead to obsessive thoughts that dominate our minds. They make us curtail what we experience as a way to manage our anxiety and disappointment. They make us turn to alcohol or any kind of habits to numb the pain. Without realizing it, we assume a negative and fearful attitude toward life. This becomes our self-imposed prison. But this is not how it has to be. The freedom that Chekhov experienced came from a choice, a different way of looking at the world, a change in attitude. We can all follow such a path. This freedom essentially comes from adopting a generous spirit towards others and towards ourselves, by accepting people, by understanding, and if possible, even loving them for their human nature. We can liberate our minds from obsessive and petty emotions. We can stop reacting to everything people do and say. We can have some distance and stop ourselves from taking everything personally. Mental space is freed up for higher pursuits. When we feel generous towards others, they feel drawn to us and want to match our spirit. When we feel generous towards ourselves, we no longer feel the need to bow and scrape and play the game of false humility while secretly resenting our lack of success. Through our work and through getting what we need on our own, without depending on others, we can stand tall and realize our potential as humans. We can stop reproducing the negative emotions around us once we feel the exhilarating power from this new attitude. We will want to take it as far as possible. Years later, in a letter to a friend, Chekhov tried to summarize his experience in Taganrog, referring to himself in the third person. Write about, this is in quotes by the way, write about how this young man squeezes the slave out of himself drop by drop, and how one fine morning he wakes to find that the blood coursing through his veins is no longer the blood of a slave, but that of a real human being. Done with what I wanted to read, or the analogy from Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. It's a good book to read, and I actually recommend you reading it. It's dope. I found myself coming back to it like so many times. You understand the different examples and stuff like that. You understand? It's quite dope. There's a saying by Friedrich Nietzsche who says, "You are never destroyed by anyone except yourself." So take a hold of your life henceforth from now on. Own your mind. Become yourself. Going back to the plot developed in the part 2. So how exactly does Dmitry Fyodorovich Karamazov plan to execute this base plan of his? I do not know. It wasn't exactly revealed yet in the story at this point. But Fyodor Pavlovich, in hopes of luring Grushenka to his side, planned to send Ivan Fyodorovich, his second son, to Tesh Chemashnya. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but we move on. He planned to send his second son to Chemashnya on a 2 or 3 days journey. A purchaser had turned up for a corpse land which Fyodor Pavlovich owned. A copse land is a small group of trees and shrubs often set apart from other woodlands. The purchaser would give Fyodor Pavlovich 8,000 rubles for the timber. Fyodor Pavlovich wanted to send Ivan Fyodorovich to represent him in making this deal with the purchaser of the corpse so that Grushenka can come to his home while Ivan was away. Fyodor Pavlovich possessed the big envelope with 3,000 rubles in it, tied up with ribbon and sealed with 3 seals. On it is written in Fyodor Pavlovich's own hand, "To my angel, Grushenka, if she will come, and for my little chicken." Fyodor Pavlovich had then arranged with the valet, Smediakov, by his orders, to go away to the lodge so that Smediakov wouldn't sleep till midnight. Smediakov would be on the watch, getting up and walking about the yard, waiting for Grushenka to come. Fyodor Pavlovich informed Smediakov that he believed Grushenka was afraid of Dmitri, and so she may choose to come through the back way late at night to him. And if Grushenka did not come, then Smediakov should run up and knock at his door or at the window from the garden. Smediakov should knock at first twice, rather gently, and then 3 times, more quickly. Then Fyodor Pavlovich said, "I shall understand at once that she has come and will open the door to you quietly." Another signal Fyodor Pavlovich gave to Smediakov in case anything unexpected happened was at first 2 knocks and then, after an interval, another much louder. Then Fyodor Pavlovich would understand that something had happened suddenly and that Smediakov must see him. And he will then open the door for Smediakov so that Smediakov could go and speak to him. This was all in case Grushenka couldn't come herself but sends a message. Besides, Dmitry Fyodorovich might come too, and so Smediakov must let Fyodor Pavlovich know that Dmitry is near. Fyodor Pavlovich was awfully afraid of Dmitry Fyodorovich, so that even if Grushenka had come and was locked in with him, and Dmitry were to turn up anywhere near at the time, Smediakov should be bound to let Fyodor Pavlovich know at once, knocking 3 times, so that the first signal of 5 knocks meant Grushenka had come, while the second signal of 3 knocks meant something important to tell him. But unknown to Fyodor Pavlovich, Smediakov had already divulged these plans to Dmitry Fyodorovich, who had threatened Smediakov persistently, and Smediakov had finally given in to Dmitry to show his slavish devotion, so that Dmitry might be satisfied that Smediakov was not deceiving him, but was telling Dmitry all he could. Ivan Fyodorovich, in an encounter with Katerina Ivanovna at the home of Madame Holakov, a friend, a wealthy lady who was no more than 33 and had been 5 years a widow. Ivan revealed that although he loved Katerina Ivanovna, he was aware that the feeling wasn't mutual with her towards him, and so to put an end towards his association with Katerina Ivanovna for his own benefit, he would leave and he would go far away and he shall never come back. Fyodor Pavlovich then sent Ivan to Chemash Chemasia. I've had a lot of like pronouncing this stuff, but bear with me. But Ivan changed his mind on his way and went to Moscow instead. Smediakov had informed Fyodor Pavlovich the morning that Ivan left that Smediakov had informed Fyodor Pavlovich that morning that Ivan left that Grushenka would finally come that evening of that day. Smediakov had also informed Fyodor Pavlovich 2 days prior to that day that he had told Grushenka how and where to knock to notify Fyodor Pavlovich of her presence. But Smediakov had had an epileptic fit that day that Grushenka was to come and could not be able to stand alert to receive Grushenka when she eventually would come. An old Grigory, who might have stood in for Smediakov, had not been well for the last 3 days. He was completely laid up by his lumbago, which is pain in the lower back region. So that's where we are now. And this part 2 has probably set up something dramatic to occur in the part 3. And God said, "Love your enemy." And I obeyed him and loved myself. Khalil Gibran. Our ability to love ourselves sets us free. Our ability to forgive ourselves renews our essence to live, to express, to forge ahead towards a better direction and become ourselves yet again. The best analogy to explain this is the parable of the unforgiving servant. I'm going to be reading from the New International Version of the Bible, from Matthew 18:21 to 35. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I'll pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, cancelled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I'll pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I cancelled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servants, just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he could. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. We are done with the parable. From my perception, this parable points out at how we human beings are addicted to suffering in our thoughts, our minds. The unforgiving servant lets the fear, his enemy, within him to overcome the very essence of love that caused him to lend his fellow servant or colleague money in the first instance, forgetting that that grace which the king had extended to him was out of that same love, which caused him to be in relation with his colleague. Fathers and teachers, I ponder, what is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love. Father Zuzima.